All right, welcome everybody to our Resource YYC Lunch and Learn. Today we have Samuel, a lawyer associated with our new partner, Good Lawyer, and he will be presenting on small business contract law. Samuel?
All right, thank you. I know we have Katie in the room. Katie, are we going to be doing the slides from your end, or do you want me to do from over here?
If you're able to get them on your computer, that'd be great.
Yeah, I have them over here.
Sit and observe.
All right, that's perfect. I'm just trying to do the. I'm not so savvy. It might not be on here. I'm going to share my screen with everyone. And you can see it's not on full screen. Let me see. Oh, here, present. Hey, look at that. Okay. All right, so let's get into it. So I guess I'll start by way of brief introduction just to talk about myself and my practice. So my name's Sam Michaels. I practice out of Toronto in Ontario. Most of what my practice does is working with small to medium-sized businesses, everything from incorporation, contract drafting, and then structuring. Structuring is really bringing companies together and bringing together the different shareholders and members of the company. So that's onboarding employees, financing for the company, going through its different, processes that are needed to grow the company in terms of options or equity offerings, all that good type of stuff. So that's most of my work. I also do a little bit of litigation from time to time. For today's presentation, we're really going to be diving into the contract side of building a business. And I usually like to do this presentation working sort of from the inside outwards of the company, starting at the sort of core of what's necessary and then building out for all those important pieces. In terms of today's agenda, we're going to go through our introductions and get ground rules. We're going to talk about contracts and how they affect the business. And then we're going to have a little conclusion and Q&A time. So if you do have questions, please save them for the end or write them in the chat, and I'll get to them at the end, or we can discuss at the end of the presentation. This presentation is being brought to us from Good Lawyer, which is a legal help platform that I do some work for. Amongst a number of lawyers across Canada. They're basically available to answer questions when you go on the Good Lawyer website at goodlawyer.ca. You can use the coupon you see here, AMA20, for 50% off a legal advice session. So the legal advice session, I believe, are like only 50 something after tax, so they're not very expensive, and 50% off. It's a good option if you want to speak with a lawyer about your legal question or issue. A few things to keep in mind, just to keep microphones off during the presentation, leave your questions in the chat, and just to keep in mind that this is an information presentation. If your question requires specific legal advice, specific guidance, or your situation overall requires that, then reach out to us after. You can use the promo code and book a consult with me. So I already gave a little intro on myself. I did my law school at Osgood. I also do have an Access to Justice project that I work on called Canada Legal Help. It's really more in the sort of not-for-profit area, so I have a little bit of experience in both sides, for-profit and not-for-profit. So when it comes to the contracts, let's sort of get into the meat of it here. As I mentioned, I like to start at the inner core of the business and then start sort of working our way outwards, right, with all the contracts that we're going to need, because obviously as the company grows and changes, the contractual needs change as well. So we're starting at the beginning. First thing I like to look at is what type of company is this and who's involved. And so are we talking about a corporation or are we talking about a sole proprietorship? If there's more than one person involved and it's not a corporation, that's called a partnership. Whether there's 2, 3, 4, 5, still a partnership. Once you're incorporated, it's called a corporation. The corporation is considered a separate legal person, pays separate taxes, has separate liability. And the corporation, the people involved, are called shareholders. They own shares. So in the corporation context, if we're looking at a company with just one person, or in the sole proprietor context, we're looking at just one individual, probably don't need a contract with yourself. There's some situations where you need like a shareholder declaration, but for the most part, you're probably okay. Let's say there's more than one person. So if there's more than one person and you're not incorporated, that would be a partnership agreement. If you're more than one person and you're in a corporation, in a corporate entity, that would be a shareholders agreement. And I know I'm kind of glossing over a little of the definitions with corporation and shareholders and shares. It's just for the sake of expediency, because unfortunately we only have an hour here today. There are other presentations I run where I go into more about like what is a corporation and all that stuff. So, follow Good Lawyer, I guess, through social media is probably the best way to stay up to date on all that. So getting back to the shareholders agreement, partnership agreement, this is essentially the agreement between the individuals who run the company. And this is the agreement that says how we're going to run the company and what happens if there's a problem. I like to always analogize it back to insurance, right? It's sort of like when you have your car and you have your car insurance. When you get in the car every day, you're not reading your insurance policy in the morning before you start driving. But if you get in an accident, you're going to be very glad that that insurance is there to sort of sort through what happens next. Shareholders agreement, partnership agreement, they serve a similar role. If you're running a restaurant, you're not reading your shareholders agreement every morning before you start cooking the recipes. You know what to do for your business. But if you and your co-founder have a falling out, or one goes bankrupt, or somebody commits a criminal act through the corporation, or God forbid somebody passes away or gets sick and can't be part of the company anymore. That's the car crash that when we have the shareholders agreement in place, the shareholders agreement is going to be like the insurance policy that says, okay, here's what we do in this situation. It's not going to resolve it for you, right? Same as a car crash. Your car still crashed. You still have to deal with all that. But at least it's going to lay out steps and make it straightforward of, okay, here's what I need to do. Here's how I'm going to resolve this problem. So first thing I always look at is, okay, who do we have involved? What type of corporate entity is this, or a partnership entity? So we have some agreements right on the inside, right, to deal with that relationship and govern that relationship between the people. The next thing I look at is that the business itself is protected before it starts going outwards. So it starts reaching out to the market or investors or whoever it is. So usually that involves intellectual property. Right? If you're inventing, you come back to the restaurant, you have your own recipes that you came up with, or you have your own brand or name that you came up with, or you're developing software and you came up with your own patentable technology. So that's definitely the next piece I would look at. And that varies a lot by the company. It really depends what you're doing, what you're working on. But there probably is going to be some sort of contract or registration that's going to make sense if you have some intellectual property to protect. So the next step for a lot of businesses, right, you need money. You got to spend money to make money. And for that, you got to get money. The infinite cycle continues. So when we're looking at getting funding, this is often but not always the next step, right, for a business. You form the core of the business. We're going to have 3 shareholders. We're going to have a patent. We're going to have a trademark. Let's grow this thing. So there's 2 in Canada. There's 2 sort of main avenues. And again, for expediency, I'm going to just kind of skip by some of the other avenues that are available. But the 2 main ones for financing are through debt or through equity, through giving out shares or options or a percentage of the ownership of your company. So when we're thinking about debt financing, the contracts for that are typically going to be from a bank, right, or from the party who's providing the financing. So for example, a lender, if it's an institutional lender like a bank or an angel investor, they're probably going to have their own lawyers who provide their documents to you. And in that case, what we're doing is we're reviewing the documents, right? Making sure that our rights aren't overly impeded by the obligations that we're entering into. On the other hand, if it's equity financing, right, we're giving somebody a percentage of ownership. In that case, it's going to be a little different contract-wise. Probably the first thing I would recommend would be a term sheet. Term sheet is a basic document that just lays out what's in the company and what are we offering. Right? So the company has 100 Class A shares. Class A shares have voting rights and they get a dividend. and we're offering 25 shares at $100,000 or whatever it is. 25,000 shares at $100,000, however you want to do it. There's a lot of options, so I also can't get too much into the tax sides of different share issuances, unfortunately. Another, I think, interesting discussion. But basically what you would be doing is you're sending out a term sheet. You tell the person, this is what you can buy. They send it back. They say, okay, I agree. And then at that point, you're probably updating your shareholders agreement, right, to bring them in as a party to that shareholders agreement. So also so important as we're going through the steps that we're protecting our intellectual property along the way. If we're going out to reach out to investors, reaching out to people as potential co-founders to join the business, we want to make sure that we have proper NDAs in place, non-disclosure agreements, proper intellectual property protection to make sure that there won't be any issues. Nobody will steal what you're working on or try to take it from you. I do think, again, there's a whole other conversation there about where NDAs are needed. I don't think it's all the time. I do think there's plenty of opportunities where you can talk about your business openly without a non-disclosure agreement. But it's good to have that agreement in place so that for the times where you need it, you have it ready to go. All right, so as we make our way outward from the company, we start at the core, right? Who's founding this company and what are the contracts to bind them? How are we financing the company? How do we bind those people in? Is it through debt? Is it through equity? Now we're working our way outwards even more. We're going to market, selling our stuff. Maybe that means literally going to a market and opening your stall and selling your stuff. Maybe it means you're a consultant and you provide all your services online through Zoom calls. Who knows? Either way, and anything in between, there's probably some contracts that should be in place for once you start providing your service. So I said providing a professional service or selling a product. But to be clear, I think professional services, there sometimes can be the connotation of like, is a accountant or a doctor or a lawyer, is that a professional service? To be clear, all services and products, there really should be most likely some contractual foundation somewhere. So this, again, is going to vary a lot by what industry you're in, what you're selling, what you're doing, and how you're selling it. So for example, if I'm working for a retail store that sells clothing, I'm not going to tell them to have a service agreement with every client. That would be entirely ludicrous if you walked into a mall and had to sign a contract. For those businesses, they have a receipt. And on the back of the receipt, you'll actually see terms related to the purchase. And that's sufficient for that business. I have other businesses, for example, I have accountants that do cloud-based accounting. So they access the software that their client uses and they do the filings for them. So for them, absolutely, you need both. I shouldn't say need, but really important to have both a service agreement with the individual client and a terms of service for their practice overall that encompasses all the terms about their access to the client files and ongoing access to the cloud service provider and all that. And then there's everything in between, right? It really depends what's being offered. There's, I like to say to my clients, like, for any relationship, unless it's illegal, lawyers have thought of some sort of contractual arrangement to make it work, right? So if you come to your lawyer and you say, I want to sell this, or I want to buy this, I want to do this with this person, as long as you're not doing something illegal, you're not misrepresenting something, you're not committing a crime, there's some sort of contract out there for you. Distribution agreement, wholesale agreement, license agreement, supplier agreements, service agreements, product sale agreements. There's anything under the sun that you can think of. But I do think it's very important to have one of those in place, right? It goes back to the analogy I drew earlier. If you're selling your goods, let's say you're the accountant and the cloud software that you use goes down, or it stops working. If you don't have something in place in your terms and conditions that says, that you're disclaiming that liability and that your client acknowledges that, then the client can come after you and they can try and sue and say, hey, it's your fault that this went down. And then you're basically left in a back and forth. If you have the contract in place, sure, they can try to sue. They can say it's your fault, but then you can rely on that contract as evidence and go, well, you know what, I understand this happens. I acknowledge the problem. I do what I can to fix it. But we do have this contract where you already agreed that if something happened and this cloud service went down, I wouldn't be held personally responsible. Right. So very important in that worst case scenario to be able to rely on a good contractual foundation. And then, oh, yeah, and then also as you're looking outward, I guess the other piece that I just wanted to mention is that the intellectual property is going to evolve as well, right? As you maybe in development, you come up with a patent and a trademark, but as you grow, you might find, okay, now we need a trademark in more markets, right? Now we need the trademark in the US, in Europe, in Australia, in India, in China, wherever it might be. So making sure that as you start looking outwards, right, with that service, you got to keep that protection in place because originally you're protecting between 2, 3, 4 founders. Then you're protecting for your investors, and then you're protecting for the market at large. Obviously, a lot of the work you do down here is going to work the whole way, right? Like if you have a trademark for your name, that trademark should serve the purpose. Let's say you have a Canadian trademark, that'll serve the purpose in Canada as far as you go, unless the business substantially changes its activities or something. There are some limited exceptions, but for the most part. On the other hand, the business at day one might not even be contemplating going out of Canada, right? So if on day one you get the trademark for Canada and you say, okay, that's it for the Canadian market, we're good, that's great. But you do need to think about, if let's say you launch in the States or get acquired by a company in the States, they're going to need the trademark rights down there as well. And so there's a bit of change that can go on. So you start your IP protection, right at the beginning. Some of it will work the whole way as you grow, but it needs to be supplemented over time, right? You need to be revisiting it, I would say biannually, yearly, right? It doesn't have to be, every week or every month, but you do need to be looking at those things and thinking about, okay, do we need to make adjustments? So when we're thinking about the future, right? Planning for the future. We have our foundation built, we're financed, we're selling our product. Now we're starting to look outwards towards growth, right? How do we really take off with this company? So when we get to this stage, I think the contract picture kind of changes a little. You've moved basically at this point, you've fully transitioned from you're growing a business to you're a company. You're running a company at this stage, right? You're in markets, you have investors, you have property that's protected, you have founders with share equity. You're basically running, you're running a business, same as any business that you are familiar with, any brand name. So once we're in that stage, the contract picture does change. And a big part of my work is taking clients through that stage because it's a big transition, right? You're used to running things yourself. You're running the show. You know everyone who's involved. You probably know all your employees. You know all your suppliers. So you probably know a good portion of your customers. Once you evolve past that, it's a big transition, and it's also a mental transition of, okay, I'm maybe still a small business by the technical qualifiers, but I'm running a company. I'm running a full organization, and there's responsibility above and beyond just myself. Right? The corporation or the company is the one with the ultimate responsibility. So in that case, we want to start looking basically at the whole picture. And this is the thing I mentioned right at the beginning, the structuring. Right? How is our company structured? How is it set up? So at this stage, we're looking back at our shareholders agreements, our investor agreements, our service agreements, and making sure everything's aligned to actually operate and run, usually not automated, but with some degree of automation, right? That every service agreement should be revisited for every customer. Like, for example, if you go in to McDonald's, they're not checking the language on every receipt, right? But, these things get standardized, and you go to any McDonald's in Canada, you're pretty much going to see almost identical language on the back of every receipt with some variation because the provincial laws change a little bit. But, for the most part, once you're running a company, you're going to see some standardization across the contracts, right? You're not drafting it up per client. You're having one modus operandi, one way that you run things that goes across the board for all the customers that you work with. Also at this stage, right, we need more people, we need a bigger team to actually service our client base. So at this point, we really move from, okay, we can get away with, maybe we have a friend or a family member who's doing some contract work and they don't have a proper agreement. Now we're running a company. We need our employees with proper contracts, right? And again, when I say need, I don't mean like you're not going to jail otherwise, but it just means like it's very, very crucial to avoid significant liability or the risk of significant liability. So the contracts we put in place are really going to depend on the roles that people serve in the company. You come in from time to time, you're a sales agent, you do some remote sales on your own, but you work for 50 different companies doing sales. You're a contractor, you're not an employee. You come in to work every day, you're 9 to 5, you're using our business card, our email, our clients, you're working purely under our instructions. You're an employee, you need an employment agreement. Right, so we need to run through that exercise with everybody on the team to say, okay, who's working here? What do they do? Proper contracts to formalize the relationship between the company and that individual. And that generally means independent contractor agreements and employment agreements. With that, we also want to put in place or consider putting in place workplace policies, right? So that's social media, a whistleblower policy, policies surrounding workplace conduct, harassment, anti-discrimination, all those good things. So once we're moving to a company, it's not on us anymore as individuals to just set the rules. It's not on us to just say, hey, Jim, you were a jerk today and you got to stay home tomorrow. Doesn't work anymore for a company, right? If you think about a larger corporate entity, you better believe that if at McDonald's an employee acts improperly, the supervisor isn't just saying, you know what, a week off for you. There's a proper procedure. There's a chain to follow where any incident gets investigated, gets reported, gets analyzed, and a decision is reached based on standards of, okay, you did this type of thing, this is the punishment, or this is the result that's going to come from it. So very important that we're standardizing these things. It doesn't have to be to the level of a large corporation like a McDonald's or a Timmy's, but there needs to be something beyond, I run the business, so I just decide, who works here and who gets punished and who gets put on suspension and whatever. That doesn't fly anymore once you're running a company, right? So can be talking something as small as 5-10 employees, but we're talking about the way the company runs, right? Once it's at a certain level of operation, that those employees are expected to work under a level of standardization, that needs to be across the board. So if you have 10 employees, you're expecting them to all be doing the same level of work effort and commitment, and all those processes are standard. It's got to be the same when it comes to disciplining them, terminating them, dealing with issues in the workplace, right? It can't be it's standard over here, but when there's problems over here, I just sort it out myself. That doesn't work anymore for a company. It works for a sole proprietor, a very small business, your quote unquote mom and pop shop. But once you're making that transition, you got to think in company terms. And this is really, I press this a lot because this is a lot of my work with clients, is moving them from, the small business stage to the company stage. And I think the last thing I'll just say on this point is that you can have, a lot of hurdles. Like the expenses ramp up. It's the fact of business, right? Like the more you grow your business, the more things cost. As you have one person on payroll, it's going to payroll cost less than when you have 50 people on payroll, right? If you're buying inventory to serve 500 customers, it's going to cost less than inventory for 5,000 customers. But the idea of all these things is that they're an investment. They're part of building the business for the future so that the business can grow and operate successfully and get to that next stage. And the legal is part of it, right? So I tell my clients, like, even as the cost ramps up a little, and for me, I don't, I'm not affiliated with a big law firm, so my costs are not exceptional. But I recognize that it's more for a small business. Like it's certainly something to think about once you're spending on all the legal fees. But when you don't have that in place, it really can kill a business. So just to give one example, if you have a business running with contractors instead of employees, and those people are actually employees. That's a determination that can be made by the court. So even if I have a contract that says this person's an independent contractor, and the person says, I agree, I'm an independent contractor, the court can still say later, in case of a dispute, this is a very limited area of law. This doesn't apply to all contracts. In this area of law, the court can say, no, the person was actually an employee. The court can basically like unwind the contract. And there's a whole bunch of litigation and precedent around why that is. It doesn't apply to everything. So don't worry that courts will just unwind all your contracts. But in this particular case, where somebody was actually an employee, but as a means of basically defrauding CRA, they were labeled a contractor, the court can relabel them as an employee. If that happens, the company can have to pay all the deductions owed to CRA over the lifetime of that person with the company. So let's say you're running a company with 10 people working for you. You have 10 people there. They're there for 10 years each. They're paid $50,000 each. If you've been paying them as contractors, you will owe, if they get reclassified, 10 years, 10 people, taxes on $50,000 times 10 times 10. It's an enormous amount of money, and it can drive a company into bankruptcy, and it does, right? That does happen, where companies are like, oh, my employees got reclassified, I now have to go bankrupt. So having the proper contracts, right? Not just any contract, but the proper contract is so important, because at day one, your lawyer would look at that and say to you, look, this person's an employee. Here's the employment agreement that you need to give them. This is a pretty extreme case, but I do think it's important to say, like, even though there is more cost involved and more time involved in getting these agreements, and sure, putting something on payroll has a lot of cost too. That certainly adds to it. Those things should be seen as an investment for the future and as a way of avoiding liability or potential issues that can be really, really destructive to the business down the road. So we're going to get into some Q&A. I've actually made pretty good time. So we're going to have 10-15 minutes to go through some questions if anyone has. This is a rare and wonderful occasion. I'm usually scrambling to catch up, but once in a while I get hit with being on time for the presentations. So we have lots of time for questions, but I did want to touch on a few just sort of, I guess, basic or easy points to just sort of take home with you based on the presentation so far. So the first thing is really, start early, right, and review things often. Obviously, I'm saying you start as you incorporate, as you do your sole proprietor and set it up. Start at the beginning, and as you go through those growth stages, or even just on a sort of a recurring basis, right, where you just say, okay, every 3 months, every 4 months, every 6 months, maybe every year, it might be a little long. Just look back at your contractual foundation, look back at what you have, and see, okay, this is what we need to change, this is what we need to do. I think it's so important that your relationships should be in some sort of written form, right, in some sort of formalized format. I mentioned earlier, I think it's really true. Unless you're doing something illegal, almost every type of contractual or business relationship has some sort of contract that some lawyer has invented that will work for it. I'm yet to come across something even within sort of novel spaces like companies doing token offerings, or people working in like AI software and products. Even in those spaces, for the relationships themselves between the parties, there's generally a contract that works for them. I'm yet to come across a situation where there isn't, except where somebody wants to do something that maybe is a little bit misrepresentative or not, I wouldn't say illegal, but maybe like in a bit of a gray area. That's where you can run into problems. But generally, if you have an important relationship, there should be some sort of contract for it. And there will be, if it's a relationship that you can't define yourself in contract, speak with a lawyer and they probably will know, what contract makes sense for that. And that leads right into my third point. Don't be afraid to seek out help. Good Lawyer is a great resource. I say that not only because I'm one of the lawyers listed there, but I do think anything that improves access to justice and accessibility, improves the ability for people to just Google, I need a lawyer, and find good resources. That's a mission I've been on since first year law school, basically. So I think it's improving. Things are getting better in that regard. There are more resources available. In terms of free resources, it's still limited. For most business things, you do really need to speak with the lawyer. There isn't the same like legal aid availability as for like family matters, for example, or criminal matters. That's a larger systemic discussion for another day. But there is a greater availability of low cost resources. So I always tell people, don't be afraid to reach out. And look, at the worst, even if, let's say you don't go to a good lawyer, you just book a consult with a lawyer and it costs you $300 for an hour, I think should be a good use of your time, right? Even if it is an investment, there's no reason why you should be walking away not feeling like you learned a whole lot in that hour. If you do, then there might have been a problem with the person you consulted. But if you don't want to spend $300 an hour, you have good lawyer as one option that's available, that you're still speaking with a lawyer, still the same quality service, just a heck of a lot cheaper. So right now there are options, the full paid option and online resources, and there's also quite a bit written online in terms of blogs and just like sort of starter resources to just get you moving, get you set off on the right foot. So I always say, don't be afraid to seek out help. The most difficult thing that I deal with businesses is businesses that try to do too much themselves, right? You have somebody who's like, they run a restaurant, they're really great at cooking, and they go off and file their own trademark application, and there's mistakes in it, and now work needs to be done to rectify that application. So look for help. I trust my business owners. That I always tell them, like, you're the best at running your business, right? Like, I trust them to do the business. I'm never going to tell my restaurant owner how to cook his meals. He knows how to do that. But when it comes to the trademark filing, when it comes to the contract drafting, that's what I know how to do, right? So I think it's very important to seek out that help and place that trust in the right people, to work with your team and get that done for you. So I think I saw, sorry, I have some window overlap. Okay, there we go. So I saw a couple questions. Oh, I think we have. Okay, we have one question here. And if anyone else has any questions, we can throw them in the chat as well. Or I think that might be the easiest, because we have a few people here today. So it's good to have a good audience, but just with Zoom, it can be a little tough with if people if you have two mics coming in at once, right, it can be hard to hear. So I have this one question. If anyone else wants to ask any questions, by all means, you can add them to the chat here. Okay, so my question: if one already has a consulting business in oil and gas, what steps should be taken to expand the business into an import-export clothing and accessory business? Okay, so in terms of a business moving from one activity to another, I think really it probably should be a separate corporation, right? It's you don't want any potential liabilities or tax consequences from one activity to seep into the other activity. These, when we're talking completely different activities, like for example, if we have like a restaurant doing catering, okay, fine, that's both food production or whatever. It's both within the same sort of realm. But we're talking about oil and gas extraction to importing clothing. These are just completely different spheres and industries. So I'd probably recommend to dissolve the first corporation and then open a new company, right? Open a second corporation, doing the goods. Maybe, I guess, you don't necessarily have to do it through a dissolution. You could do kind of continuance into a different activity, but it's not really like an expansion of one business, right? It'd be like ramping down one operation and then sort of moving forward with another. Oh, okay, so we got one more question, and by all means, if anyone else has questions, please feel free to ask. A recent BBA and HR graduate, are there specific contracts that should be prioritized for HR professionals, which I dive into? Definitely look at your college or professional organization. I'm not sure what province you're in, probably Alberta. But I believe there would be a professional organization there for human resource, which I believe is HR. HR can also be human rights, but I believe, yeah. Okay, human resource. Yeah. So, you should have a professional organization that they'll probably have put out some guidelines and some information. Other than that, for HR, I mean, generally, like, it would be like a consulting agreement or a service agreement if you're doing like kind of an in-house role with a company. Um, and in the service agreement, you probably want some uh, conditions in that agreement stating what your licensing is, right? And some representations about maintaining that licensing through the life of the contract. But beyond that, you're not in a super regulated, like it's a regulated field, but it's not like, like medicine or something where it's extremely regulated. So, I would look into your local provincial staff. Right, as mentioned, I'm in Ontario, so the rules here do vary slightly. But generally, the professional organizations do a good job of putting out the resources, and in terms of the contract, the ones I've done for HR are professionals are generally fairly straightforward service agreements. So our next question here, if I hire a contractor via registered company, however, this contractor's only business is supplying me 100% of his services to my company, yeah, possibly you could be in trouble. Like it really depends on, quite a bit about what the specific relationship is, what's being done by the contractor. Does the contractor have freedom to leave? Is it essentially a move for tax purposes? Like, I think that's really the question to ask at the end of the day. Like, is this somebody who is actually an employee, but for tax benefits, you guys set it up as two companies? If you did it like that to get around taxes, unfortunately, CRA, they're sometimes not the smartest, but they're smart enough for that one, right? Where they see a relationship that is an employment relationship that's been, reclassified just for the purpose of avoiding tax. That could be an issue. However, there are industries where it's not an issue at all. So, for example, like the trucking industry, it's very, very common to have independent contractors, and they can work for one person for 1, 2, 10 years, and still be a contractor. So it really depends. It really depends. What industry you're in and what the services being provided are, what the business is. If you want to book a consult with me, you can do that through the Good Lawyer platform. You'll see my name will pop up there. I'll ask, I'm not sure if Kay's still with us, but Kay, if you could put the link in the chat if you have a moment. I think for some of that stuff in terms of the contractor employee, you really need to dive a little bit more into the specifics of the company to know, how big a risk we're facing. And we have one more here. I've had to hire. Okay, so we're, I can speak to this, but we'll try and stick with the contract questions. So I was hired by a lawyer and given a bill higher than the price quoted. Is there a way to only pay the quoted price? I mean, sure, pay the quoted price, right? If there's nothing in writing speaking to the increase in charges, I wouldn't see any reason why the lawyer would have authority to pay more than they quoted. You'll have to review your retainer agreement and see what the work completed was. And, it depends what instructions you gave, right? If you told the lawyer, please spend an extra 5 hours on this, I mean, sure, they would then have a right to bill for that amount. But if you quoted, you were quoted on X service, you requested X service, you were provided X service, you should pay the price quoted for X service. So yeah, again, it depends a little bit more about the specifics, but in general, if the services rendered match the quote, then the price should also match the quote. My question was really, can I use a template instead of hiring a lawyer? Okay, so I'm gonna wrap up on this one because I get this question a lot. I always draw back to the same analogy for this one too. In the same way as you can cut your own hair instead of getting a barber or getting a haircut, you can use a template instead of hiring a lawyer. So there's nothing illegal about using a template. But I mean, I don't trust myself to cut my own hair. So, it's kind of the same thing, right? You when you're getting a template from online, it's hard to know if the jurisdiction is going to be correct for what you need. It's hard to know when that contract was drafted, and obviously case law is changing all the time, right? As new rules come in, that affects the way we have to draft our contracts. So it's really hard to know when you get something online, is it actually going to be current? Is it actually going to be a workable document? Am I going to go into court with this document and the judge is going to laugh at me because they're going to say, hey, this is 20 years old, what's going on here? And even if, you know, you're using a service that are providing templates that are contemporaneous, to know that the template is going to actually address the specifics of your situation rather than just sort of a general, you know, general terms for this type of situation. I personally am yet to see one. Like, I've looked, honestly, even on my end, on the back end, there's template generation systems for lawyers as well, of like quickly generate your templates and get it out to your clients through software. I've yet to find something that I was comfortable using over just my own library and Word document and custom drafting. So, you know, I'm not saying that it'll never happen. I'm sure at some point or another the software is going to get pretty good. But for the time being, I think the haircut barber analogy is pretty apt for that one. I think I'm going to conclude there. If anyone has any other questions, you can book me on Good Lawyer. I'm not sure if we're going to have a chance to get the profile into, I think, I'm not sure if we'll have a chance to get the link there, but either way, oh, thanks, Katie. Awesome. So yeah, so if everyone can see that link at the bottom, goodlawyer.ca. Yeah, so yeah, that was the part I wasn't sure. Profile/Samuel Michaels is how you connect with me. If you want to book a consult, that's where you can find me. Otherwise, I think that's about everything for today. So thank you everyone for tuning in. And I'm not sure if we have Resource YYC some last comments to conclude, but I think that's everything on my end. So thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. And I hope everyone got some good information from that. There were definitely some good questions from everybody. So thank you so much for being our presenter today, and hope everyone can check out Good Lawyer and see what services they have. And obviously great people like Sam here to talk to with your needs. So thank you very much for participating, and I hope everyone has a good rest of their day. This will be posted online.
Awesome. Thanks so much, everyone.